Thomas Sowell is the closest thing this century has come to on the order of an Emancipation Proclamation. He is a scholar who has devoted his labors to looking behind the cliches of abjection, to sing out not that there is no such thing as racial discrimination, on the contrary, not that there is an instantaneous route to affluence, but that the color of an American's skin is not a birthmark that commits him to substandard life. What is extraordinary is that the labors of Mr. Sowell, far from exciting the kind of enthusiastic reception one would expect, have met in some cases with near hysterical denunciations even from some black leaders. It is as if the head of the Anti-Slavery League had denounced Abraham Lincoln for signing the Emancipation Proclamation. Indeed, that proclamation meant that there would no longer be slavery, but it also meant that there would no longer be an anti-slavery league. Thomas Sowell was born in the South, but came north with his family as a boy, entered Stuyvesant High, from which he graduated going on to the Marines, and then matriculating in Harvard. There he received a degree in economics, going on to Columbia for his master's and to the University of Chicago for his doctorate. He has taught at Rutgers, at Howard, at Cornell, Brandeis, Amherst, was professor of economics at UCLA. He is now a senior fellow of the Hoover Institution at Stanford.
William F. Buckley, Jr., on November 12, 1981, almost exactly 30 years ago, introducing Thomas Sowell. As best I can tell, the only thing that's changed is the kind of glasses you wear, Tom. But as Bill said, you have spent your career looking behind the cliches of abjection. There was no one like him, was there? Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. As you've heard, today's guest is Dr. Thomas Sowell, whose newest book is The Thomas Sowell Reader. And Tom, I begin by pointing out something the copy editor missed. You wrote in your introduction that you were summarizing the work of a lifetime, which of course should read, summarizing the work of a lifetime so far.
On the other hand, when you're 81 years old, I think that the different distinction is not very great.
All right, segment one, equality. A quotation and another clip. The quotation from the Thomas Sowell Reader, quote, "If one confused word can gum up social policies, the legal system, and innumerable institutions throughout society, that word is equality." The video clip from the presidential campaign of 2008.
My attitude is that if the economy is good for folks from the bottom up, it's going to be good for everybody. If you've got a plumbing business, you're going to be better off if you've got a whole bunch of customers who can afford to hire you. And right now, everybody's so pinched that business is bad for everybody. And I think when you spread the wealth around, it's good for everybody.
Spread the wealth around in the name of greater equality for bus drivers and plumbers and construction workers. What's wrong with that?
What's wrong is the track record of spreading the wealth around. What has happened around the world and what is happening under the Obama administration is an attempts to spread the wealth are in fact spreading poverty.
Why?
Because you attack the people who are creating the most wealth, not only for themselves, but society. Don't forget, people don't get wealth just because they're greedy. They get wealth because other people voluntarily pay them their money. And they voluntarily part with their money only because they're getting something that they consider worth it.
So when President Obama says he wants to spread the wealth around, what he's saying is he wants to insert the government into voluntary transactions, which doesn't work.
And it doesn't work for a very simple reason.
Right.
The people at the high end of the income scale don't just stand still to be sheared like sheep. They send their money overseas, as they're doing now. I was reading the other day about some company, that needs some money for expansion or whatever, and they have overseas branches. Now, they're making that money overseas, but they're borrowing money here instead of bringing it home. And they don't bring it home because it'll be taxed to death if they bring it home. Now, you keep raising the taxes, and they'll do more and more of their businesses overseas. And the jobs that are created will be created overseas. So this is not, whether they have high or low taxes on the rich, is going to affect the rich a lot less than it's going to affect people who are looking for jobs and people who have small businesses like hardware stores and whatnot who can't move overseas.
How come you see that and Barack Obama doesn't?
Oh my goodness! Well, his whole life has been spent among people who have an entirely different vision of the world.
Different from ordinary Americans, different from you?
Both.
All right. And their vision,
Well, for one thing, it tends to be a one-step vision. They don't say what are going to be the repercussions of this if I do this, and so they think that we shouldn't have tax cuts for the rich. You say because that the rich don't need it, don't deserve it, and so forth. And
their analysis ends there.
And then it's there.
Right.
Whereas if you look back through history, you find that when you had very high taxes on upper income people, you didn't collect as much revenues in many cases as you did with lower tax rates.
The Thomas Sowell reader. Although differences in choices and performances are ignored or dismissed in politically correct quarters, such differences obviously affect differences in outcomes. And you then, in the Thomas Sowell reader, compare the different economic records. This is fascinating, but I mean, there's a lot fascinating in here, but this struck me especially. You'd compare the difference in economic performance not between whites and blacks in this country, but between whites and whites in Europe.
Yes.
Tell us about the difference between Danes and Greeks.
Oh, well, if you look at Eastern Europe and Western Europe, the economic differences between Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans is greater than that between blacks and whites in America. And people ask, why is there such a gap here? Why is there such a gap there? I say, well, ever since the Civil Rights Act, why hasn't that gap closed completely? I say, look at Eastern and Western Europe. They've been on the same Europeans. They've been on the same continent for centuries, and the gap hasn't closed. So, gaps don't close that fast.
So we need to the underlying message here is be realistic about what actually causes growth. Mm-hmm. Be realistic about the durability of culture, even of economic culture,
yes.
Work habits. And,
yes.
All right. And don't worry about income inequality. Let the rich get rich as long as the poor are getting. In other words, you don't care too much about the gap, do you, or do you?
Well, much of the gap is fictitious in the sense that the same person is in the bottom 20% today, and 20 years later, he's not. Very few of them will still be in that bottom 20%. There'll be far more of them in the top 20% who started in the bottom 20 than there are who remained in the bottom 20. So one of the problems with our statistics is that they are about abstractions. They're not about flesh and blood people. The people move through these brackets over a lifetime. Almost everybody started out at the bottom and got as high as they got. That doesn't mean when they get high up that they are the rich. There's someone who's arrived there at the end of 20 or 30 years.
One more video clip, Tom, if you don't mind.
It's hard to argue against that. Warren Buffett's secretary shouldn't pay a higher tax rate than Warren Buffett. It is wrong that in the United States of America, a teacher or a nurse or a construction worker who earns $50,000 should pay higher tax rates than somebody pulling in $50 million. Explain why somebody who's making $50 million a year in the financial markets should be paying 15% on their taxes when a teacher making $50,000 a year is paying more than that, paying a higher rate. They ought to have to answer for that. And if they're pledged to keep that kind of unfairness in place, they should remember the last time I checked, the only pledge that really matters is the pledge we take to uphold the Constitution.
So, by the way, I have to make a brief factual correction. He referred to Warren Buffett's having made $50 million. Warren Buffett later announced that last year he'd made $62 million.
Yeah, well, let's not underestimate Warren Buffett.
All right, but the President of the United States kept talking about the prima facie unfairness of a secretary, what did he say, a teacher or a nurse or a construction worker paying a higher rate than a hedge fund manager or one of the richest men in the world, Warren Buffett. Now, there's something to that, isn't there?
One of Barack Obama's great gifts is the ability to say things that are absolutely absurd and make them sound not only plausible but inspiring. First of all, the vast majority of taxes are paid by people in the upper 10% of the income thing. So the whole picture that he's painting there has no relationship to reality. It may well be that if someone has capital gains that they will pay a lower rate of taxation in a given year. Of course, capital gains are not there in a given year. You may have stock options accumulating over 5 or 10 years, and then in 1 year when you cash them in, that year you have a spike in your income.
Right.
And so the capital gains tax takes into account the fact that this wasn't all earned that particular year, even though you got it that year.
Right.
So it's ludicrous, but it's very clever ludicrousness.